The smell never left you. That was what Oberfeldwebel Ernst Bahr remembered thinking as dawn broke over the Kursk salient on July 12, 1943. Not the sound of the Maybach engine idling beneath his feet, not the voice of his commander crackling through the intercom, but the smell. Cordite and diesel, and sweat and fear, all mixed together in the close air of the Tiger's fighting compartment. After 6 days of Operation Citadel, after 6 days of grinding through Soviet defenses in the massive steel coffin that was Panzerkampfwagen 6 Tiger Ausführung E, the smell had become part of him, absorbed into his pores, woven into the fabric of his black panzer uniform. Bahr was the gunner of Tiger 231, third vehicle in the 2nd Platoon of the 2nd Company Heavy Panzer Battalion 503. He was 26 years old, a veteran of North Africa and the retreat from Moscow, and he understood with absolute clarity that this day would likely be his last. The mathematics of survival had become impossible. The Red Army knew they were coming. Every square kilometer of ground ahead was registered by Soviet artillery. Every tree line concealed anti-tank guns. Every slight depression in the earth hid T-34s waiting in ambush. And somewhere ahead, in the rolling grasslands south of Prokhorovka, the largest tank battle in history was about to begin. Through the gunner's optics, Bahr could see the morning mist lifting from the wheat fields, revealing a landscape already torn apart by war. Shell craters pocked the earth like a disease. Burned-out vehicles, both German and Soviet, dotted the approaches to the village. The wheat that had stood chest-high a week ago was now trampled flat, mixed with mud and oil and things that had once been men. July in Russia should have been beautiful. The fields should have been golden with grain ready for harvest. Instead, everything was the color of ash and blood. The Tiger's interior was cramped, despite the tank's massive external dimensions. Bahr sat in the gunner's position on the right side of the turret, his eye pressed to the Turmziel-Fernrohr articulated telescopic sight. To his left sat Oberleutnant Klaus Hartmann, the tank commander, standing in the cupola with his head and shoulders exposed to the air above. Behind them was the loader, Gefreiter Paul Weiss, a farm boy from Bavaria who had never seen a tank before the war and now could load the massive 88mm rounds with mechanical efficiency even while the world exploded around them. Below in the hull sat Unteroffizier Hans Schmidt, the driver, and Gefreiter Otto Krauser, the radio operator and hull gunner. They had been together since March when the battalion reformed in France. 5 men who had learned each other's rhythms and fears, who could communicate through grunts and gestures when the intercom failed, who had kept each other alive through battles that had killed so many others. The Tiger I was the most powerful tank in the world in July 1943, and everyone on both sides knew it. Its 88mm KWK-36 L-56 gun could penetrate any Soviet tank from distances exceeding 2,000 meters. Its frontal armor, 100mm thick and sloped at careful angles, could defeat most Soviet anti-tank weapons. Its Maybach HL-230 P45 12-cylinder engine produced 700 horsepower, enough to move the 57-ton beast at speeds approaching 40 kilometers per hour on good roads. But the Tiger was also a mechanical nightmare. It consumed fuel at staggering rates, sometimes 200 liters per 100 kilometers. Its overlapping road wheel system, while providing excellent ground pressure distribution, collected mud and froze solid in winter. Its transmission was fragile, prone to failure under the stress of combat maneuvering. Most critically, there were never enough of them. The entire German army on the Eastern Front possessed fewer than 300 Tigers in July 1943. Facing them were thousands of Soviet tanks.
Baer had stopped counting enemy tanks after the first day of Citadel. The numbers became meaningless. What mattered was the next target, the next threat, the next shot. Through 6 days of advance, Tiger 231 had claimed 17 confirmed kills, 12 T-34 medium tanks, 3 T-70 light tanks, 2 anti-tank guns. Each kill was a small victory that meant survival for a few more minutes. But for every Soviet tank destroyed, 3 more appeared. It was like fighting the tide. The intercom crackled with Hartmann's voice. All crew prepare to move. Attack formation. Range to the tree line 800 meters. Baer shifted in his seat, hands moving automatically to the traverse and elevation controls. The hydraulic traverse system was one of the Tiger's great advantages, allowing him to swing the massive turret with fingertip precision. Soviet tanks still used manual traverse, requiring the gunner to crank handles until his arms burned. But hydraulics required power, and power required fuel, and fuel was becoming critically short. The battalion had assembled during the night in a staging area 3 kilometers behind the line. 42 Tigers spread across a front of 2 kilometers, supported by Panzer IVs and infantry in half-tracks. The objective was simple in theory and suicidal in practice. Advance 7 kilometers to the Psel River, cross at Prokhorovka, and complete the encirclement of Soviet forces in the salient. Intelligence reported enemy armor concentrations ahead. The reports were wrong. Intelligence estimated 200 Soviet tanks. The actual number was closer to 800. The 5th Guards Tank Army had been held in reserve specifically for this moment. Lieutenant Grandist General Pavel Rothmistroth had positioned his forces in carefully prepared defensive positions, with clear fields of fire and protected flanks. He understood that Soviet tanks were individually inferior to the Tigers and Panthers. His solution was simple: overwhelm them with numbers. Accept casualties that would horrify Western armies. Trade 3 Soviet tanks where every German tank destroyed and counted a victory because the Soviets could replace their losses and the Germans could not. The engines idled deep into a roar as Schmidt engaged the transmission. The Tiger lurched forward, its suspension absorbing the uneven ground. Baer watched through his optics as the formation advanced. 42 steel behemoths moving in waves across the steppe. The Panthers of the Grossdeutschland Division to their left, the Mk4s of the 3rd Panzer Division to their right. Behind them, infantry in their vulnerable half-tracks. Above, nothing. The Luftwaffe was promised but did not appear. The Red Air Force owned the skies over Kursk. The morning was already hot. Inside the Tiger, the temperature climbed toward 40 degrees Celsius. The engine compartment behind them radiated heat like a furnace. Sweat ran down Baer's face, stinging his eyes, soaking through his uniform. There was no ventilation beyond the small amount of air that entered through vision ports and hatches. The choice was always between fresh air and armor protection. In combat, hatches stayed closed, and men suffocated slowly. The first Soviet artillery rounds landed at 05:47 hours. Baer heard them coming, the ascending shriek that gave perhaps 2 seconds of warning. The impacts walked across the formation, searching for targets with methodical precision. A Panzer IV 300 meters to their right erupted in flames, its thinner armor no match for the heavy shells. The crew tried to bail out, only the driver made it clear before secondary explosions consumed the tank. Hartmann's voice remained steady. "Continue advance, maintain formation spacing. Gunner, traverse left. Suspected anti-tank position at the barn, 1,100 meters." There swung the turret, the hydraulic whine audible even over the engine noise. Through his optics, the barn appeared as a collection of angles and shadows. He studied it with the practiced eye of a veteran gunner, looking for the telltale signs of concealed weapons. A straight line where nature provided only curves. A shadow darker than it should be. The glint of optics catching morning light. There, behind the collapsed wall, the distinctive shape of a Soviet anti-tank gun, probably a 76.2 mm ZS-3, range 1,100 meters, almost point-blank range for an 88 mm gun. He centered the crosshairs, compensating for the slight angle and the movement of the tank. Target acquired. The words came automatically.
Fire. The Tiger's main gun recoiled with a sound that was felt more than heard inside the fighting compartment. The breech slammed backward, and smoke filled the turret. The shell, a 10.2 kilogram armor-piercing projectile, moving at 800 meters per second, covered the distance in less than 2 seconds. Through his optics, Bear saw the barn wall explode in a shower of brick and timber. Hit. Target destroyed. Weiss was already loading the next round, a process that required lifting the heavy shell from the storage bin, aligning it with the breech, and ramming it home. Good loader. He opened breech, loaded round, closed breech, tapped Bear shoulder to signal ready. The entire process took 12 seconds. A well-trained T-34 crew could fire 3 times in that span. But the T-34 had to close to within 500 meters to penetrate Tiger's armor. The Tiger could kill at 2,000 meters. Mathematics favored the big cat. The formation continued forward. 800 meters to the tree line. 700. The wheat field ahead should have provided concealment, but 6 days of battle had reduced it to stubble and mud. There was nowhere to hide. They were exposed, visible, targets for every Soviet weapon system within 10 kilometers. The tree line erupted with muzzle flashes, dozens of them, firing simultaneously a coordinated ambush. Soviet anti-tank guns and concealed T-34s, their 76mm guns spitting flame. The sound was like a thunderstorm compressed into seconds. Shells screamed toward the German formation from multiple angles. A round struck Tiger 231's frontal armor with the sound of a massive hammer on an anvil. The entire tank shook from the impact. Bear's head slammed against the optics, opening a cut above his eye. Blood ran down his face, mixing with sweat. But the armor held. 100 millimeters of phase-hardened steel had done its job. The shell, probably an armor-piercing round from a T-34, had deflected away harmlessly. Multiple targets. Hartmann's voice had taken on the mechanical quality it always acquired in combat. Gunner's choice. Fire at will. This was it. This was what training and experience and survival instinct had prepared them for. Bear entered the state that veterans called combat focus, where time seemed to slow and the world reduced to crosshairs and targets and the rhythm of fire and reload. Target, T-34 emerging from the tree line, range 600 meters, moving left to right at approximately 20 kilometers per hour. Lead the target, compensate for movement, fire. The Tiger rocked as the gun fired. Hit. The T-34 shuddered to a halt, smoke pouring from hatches. Next target, another T-34, hull down behind a slight rise. Only the turret visible. Harder shot. Range 700 meters. Center mass on the visible portion. Fire. Miss. The round struck the earth just short. Adjust. Fire. Hit. The turret flew off the hull, propelled by the catastrophic ammunition explosion inside. Next target, next target, next target. The world became a cycle of acquisition and fire, and brief satisfaction when targets burned. Vice loaded with metronomic precision. The gun fired every 15 seconds. Shell casings piled up in the turret floor, hot brass that would burn exposed skin. The air was thick with propellant smoke despite the ventilation system. But for every Soviet tank destroyed, more appeared. They emerged from concealment in waves, using terrain and speed to close the distance. The Soviet tactics were simple and brutal. Rush forward in groups. Accept casualties. Some would die, but others would get close enough to fire at weak points in the Tiger's armor. Side armor, rear armor, the thin deck plates. At close range, even a 76mm gun could kill a Tiger. A T-34 broke through the line 200 meters to their left, racing toward a disabled Panzer IV. The Soviet tank fired on the move, its round missing wildly. But it was fast, far faster than the ponderous Tiger. Schmidt tried to bring their tank around, but the Tiger's traverse speed was painfully slow in comparison. Baer swung the turret, fighting to keep the Soviet tank in his sights. The traverse seemed to take forever, even with hydraulic assistance. The T-34 was almost behind them now, moving to attack from the vulnerable rear arc. Panic touched Baer's mind for the first time that morning. If they couldn't bring the gun to bear, they were dead.
The Tiger's turret finally aligned. Range less than 150 meters. The T-34 filled Baer's optics, every detail visible. He could see weld seams on the armor, could see the commander's hatch starting to open, could see the distinctive muzzle brake on the 76mm gun beginning to elevate toward them. Fire! At this range, the armor-piercing round didn't just penetrate the T-34's armor, it passed completely through the tank, entering the front and exiting the rear in an explosion of metal and fire. The Soviet tank lurched to a halt, already burning. But there were more, always more. The tree line had become a continuous wall of muzzle flashes. Soviet tanks advanced in a steel tide, taking casualties but never stopping. The German formation, so precise and coordinated minutes ago, was fragmenting under the assault. Individual Tigers and Panthers fought their own battles, formation coherence lost in the chaos. Tiger 211, the platoon leader's tank, took a hit to the track. The tank slewed sideways and stopped, immobilized but still fighting. Its gun continued firing, destroying 2 more T-34s before Soviet infantry emerged from the wheat with satchel charges. The crew bailed out and ran. They made it perhaps 20 meters before machine gun fire cut them down. The intercom erupted with radio traffic, requests for support, warnings of flanking movements, reports of Tigers brewing up, the tanker's euphemism for catastrophic fire. The battalion was dying. Individual vehicles lost one by one to an enemy that could afford the losses required to kill them. Tiger 231 continued fighting. Baer had lost count of kills. The gun was so hot that the paint on the barrel had burned away. The hydraulic fluid stank of overheating. Weiss's hands were blistered from handling hot shell casings. But they were alive, and the gun still fired, and that was all that mattered. Then, the ammunition ran out. Weiss tapped Baer's shoulder twice, the signal they had dreaded. Gunner, ammunition exhausted. Only machine gun remaining. The Tiger's main gun was useless without shells. They had become a mobile bunker with a single 9.72mm machine gun for defense. Hartmann made the decision instantly. Schmidt, reverse to the rally point. All speed, we're pulling back. The Tiger lurched into reverse, the transmission protesting as Schmidt pushed the vehicle to its limits. 40 kilometers per hour in reverse over broken ground, while Soviet tanks fired at them from 3 sides. It was insanity, but it was also their only chance. A round struck the turret side, the impact throwing Baer against the transverse mechanism. The armor held, but barely. He could see daylight through a crack that had appeared in the weld seam. Another hit there, and the shell would penetrate. They had to get out of direct fire before the Soviets adjusted their aim. The Tiger crashed through a destroyed T-34, its tracks climbing over the wreckage before dropping to the ground on the far side. Schmidt was driving on instinct and terror, following the marks of their advance in reverse. The rally point was 3 kilometers back, behind a slight ridge that provided some defilade from direct fire. 3 kilometers through a killing field, while every Soviet gun tried to stop them. They almost made it. The rally point was visible ahead, perhaps 800 meters, when the world erupted in orange flame. A Soviet ground attack aircraft, an Il-2 Sturmovik, had appeared from nowhere, screaming in at treetop height with its 23mm cannons firing. The armor-piercing rounds, designed specifically to penetrate tank deck armor, stitched across Tiger 231's engine deck. The Maybach engine didn't just stop. It exploded. 700 horsepower converted instantly to expanding gas and shrapnel. The explosion blew the engine deck hatches off their hinges and sent a fireball into the fighting compartment. Krauser, the radio operator in the hull, was killed instantly by shrapnel that penetrated the firewall. Schmidt, sitting just meters from the engine, was engulfed in burning fuel and oil.
Baer felt the heat before he understood what had happened. The entire rear of the tank was suddenly an inferno. The ammunition storage bins, emptied of main gun rounds but still containing machine gun ammunition, began cooking off. Rounds detonated in random directions, ricocheting inside the fighting compartment like bullets in a steel box. "Bail out!" Hartmann was already moving, throwing open his cupola hatch and pulling himself through. Weiss followed, scrambling for the loader's hatch. Baer grabbed for his own hatch, but a ricocheting round caught him in the left arm, spinning him away. Pain exploded through his shoulder, white-hot and nauseating. The fighting compartment was full of smoke and flame. Baer couldn't see, couldn't breathe, couldn't think beyond the animal need to escape. He found the hatch by touch, threw it open, pulled himself up with his good arm. The fresh air hit him like a physical force, clearing his head enough to realize he was standing on a burning tank in the middle of a battlefield with Soviet tanks less than 500 meters away. He jumped 5 feet to the ground, landing badly and rolling. His wounded arm screamed protest. Hartmann was beside him, grabbing him, pulling him toward a shell crater 20 meters away. They ran in the stumbling gait of men who had been inside a steel coffin too long, their legs weak and uncoordinated. Behind them, Tiger 231 burned. The ammunition finally reached critical temperature and detonated in a single massive explosion that tore the turret from the hull and sent it cartwheeling through the air. Baer and Weiss dove into the crater as shrapnel whistled overhead. Hartmann was already there, his face blackened by smoke, his eyes wild. "Where's Schmidt? Where's Kraus?" Baer could only shake his head. The look that crossed Hartmann's face was something beyond grief.
It was the look of a man who had lost part of himself. They lay in the crater while the battle continued around them. Soviet tanks rolled past, their crews not bothering with scattered German survivors when intact tanks still threatened. The ground shook with impacts. The air was thick with smoke and the smell of burning fuel and flesh. This was the reality of armored warfare stripped of glory and propaganda. Men burnt alive in steel coffins. Men were torn apart by explosions. Men lay wounded in shell craters, praying they wouldn't be crushed by the next tank that rolled past. Bear's arm had gone numb, which he knew was bad. He risked a look at the wound and immediately regretted it. The round had entered just below the shoulder and exited near the elbow, taking pieces of bone with it. Blood soaked his uniform, mixing with oil and dirt. He tried to apply pressure with his good hand, but the angle was wrong. Weiss saw what he was doing and moved to help, tearing a strip from his own uniform to make a crude bandage. The Battle of Prokhorovka continued for hours. From their crater, the 3 survivors of Tiger 231 watched German armor attempt to maintain the offensive and fail. They watched Tigers burn. They watched Panthers brew up after direct hits to their weaker side armor. They watched the Soviets sacrifice tank after tank to achieve their objective, which was simple: stop the German advance, break the back of Operation Citadel. By the afternoon, it was clear the Germans had lost. The 5th Guard Tank Army, despite suffering catastrophic casualties, had held the line. The Germans lacked the reserves to continue. Fuel was running out. Ammunition was exhausted. Most critically, the cream of the Panzer forces had been ground down in 6 days of brutal attrition warfare. The survivors of Heavy Panzer Battalion 503 received orders to withdraw during the afternoon. What had been a battalion of 42 Tigers was reduced to 11 operational vehicles. The rest were destroyed or broken down or simply out of fuel. Hartmann, Bear, and Weiss were evacuated with other wounded in half-tracks that somehow survived the gauntlet of Soviet fire. The journey back to German lines took 3 hours, each one an eternity of pain and fear. Bear drifted in and out of consciousness, his body finally allowing itself to acknowledge the trauma it had endured.
The field hospital was chaos. Hundreds of wounded arrived simultaneously, overwhelming the medical staff. Bear was triaged as urgent but not critical. His arm could wait while men with sucking chest wounds and traumatic amputations were treated. He lay on a stretcher in a tent and watched doctors and nurses work with desperate efficiency to save what they could. When his turn finally came, the surgeon took one look at his arm and shook his head. "The bone is shattered. The muscle tissue is too damaged. We have to amputate, or you'll develop gangrene." Bear, floating on morphine and exhaustion, simply nodded. He had seen enough death to understand that losing an arm was actually luck. He would survive. Schmidt and Krauss would not. The amputation was performed that evening by lamplight. Bear was unconscious through most of it, which was mercy. When he woke, his left arm ended just below the elbow. The surgeon had done clean work, leaving enough limb that a prosthetic might be fitted eventually. But Bear's days as a tank gunner were over. His war was over. He learned later that Operation Citadel had been abandoned. The German offensive, meant to encircle and destroy Soviet forces in the Kursk salient, had instead destroyed the German panzer forces. The Wehrmacht would never again launch a major offensive on the Eastern Front.
From July 1943 onward, the war in the East would be defensive retreat, a slow, grinding defeat. The statistics of Prokhorovka were disputed by both sides, each claiming victory based on different metrics. The Soviets had lost more tanks in raw numbers, perhaps 300 destroyed or damaged beyond repair, but they could replace those losses within weeks. German tank losses were fewer, perhaps 70 Tigers and Panthers destroyed, but each one was irreplaceable. The factory capacity to build new Tigers could not match the rate of loss. The trained crews to man them could not be replaced at all. Heavy Panzer Battalion 503 was reformed in August with replacement Tigers and crews transferred from training battalions, but it was not the same unit. The veterans were gone, killed or wounded or transferred to other formations. The replacements were young men with minimal training, thrust into combat in the most powerful tank in the world without understanding how to survive in it. Baer spent 3 months in hospitals before being evacuated to Germany. His arm healed slowly, complicated by infection that nearly killed him in September. But he survived, nursed back to health by overworked doctors who were seeing more wounded every day as the Wehrmacht retreated across Russia. He was awarded the Iron Cross First Class for his actions at Prokhorovka. The citation mentioned 17 confirmed kills, extraordinary bravery under fire, and devotion to duty. He attended the ceremony in Berlin with his uniform pinned up where his left arm should have been, and wondered what 17 dead Soviet tankers had to do with bravery or duty. They had simply been trying to stop him from killing them. He had been trying to stop them from killing him. Bravery was a word used by people who had never been inside a burning tank. Hartmann and Weiss survived the war. Hartmann was captured by the Soviets in 1945 and spent 10 years in prison camps before being released. Weiss made it to the end, surrendering to American forces in Bavaria in May 1945. They reunited in Munich in 1956 at a veterans' gathering. 3 men who had shared the worst day of their lives and somehow come through it. They did not speak of heroism. They did not speak of glory. They spoke of Schmidt screaming as he burned, of Krauss killed by shrapnel before he knew the tank was hit, of the smell inside Tiger 231 in its final minutes. These were the truths that reunions never mentioned in the speeches and toasts. These were the memories that woke them at night decades after the war ended. The Tiger I was an engineering marvel and a strategic disaster. It could destroy any tank it encountered at ranges that made retaliation impossible. But it was too complex, too expensive, too fuel-hungry for the war Germany was fighting. For every Tiger that destroyed 10 Soviet tanks, the Soviets built 50 more.
Baer understood this with the clarity that comes from having paid the price. He had crewed the most powerful tank in the world. He had destroyed enemy armor with impunity at ranges where they could not fight back. He had survived battles that killed most of his comrades, and in the end, none of it had mattered. The Soviets had more tanks, more fuel, more ammunition, more men willing to die. The Germans had excellence and courage and the finest weapons that industry could produce. Excellence lost to quantity every time. In his final years, Baer would sometimes be asked by young people about his service. They wanted to hear about glory and triumph. They wanted him to confirm their understanding of war from films and books. Instead, he would tell them about the smell inside a Tiger,
about heat that made you hallucinate, about the sound of a friend burning, about watching your arm carried away by a surgeon because staying whole meant death from gangrene. Most importantly, he would tell them about July 12, 1943, when he watched the largest tank battle in history from inside a Tiger's gun sight. He would tell them how the Soviets came in waves, how each destroyed tank was replaced by 3 more, how excellence in weapons and training could not overcome the simple mathematics of industrial warfare. He would tell them how Tiger 231 burned and took Schmidt and Krauss with it, how the finest tank in the world was reduced to a flaming wreck by a Soviet ground attack aircraft that cost a fraction of the Tiger's production expense. He would tell them that war was not glory, it was not heroism, it was mathematics written in blood and steel. It was young men burning in tanks because old men had made decisions about territory and ideology. It was the smell that never left you, even decades after you had escaped the steel coffin that should have been your grave. The Tiger I was retired from frontline service in 1944 as Panthers and King Tigers replaced it. The few survivors were lost in the retreat across Germany as fuel shortages immobilized them and crews abandoned them intact for Allied forces to study. Today, perhaps 7 operational examples exist in museums worldwide. Tourists photograph them, impressed by their size and power. Children climb on them, playing at war. Bear visited one such museum in 1982, leaning heavily on a cane, his empty sleeve pinned to his jacket. He stood before a restored Tiger, reading the placard that described its specifications and combat record. The placard mentioned firepower and armor and mechanical details. It did not mention the smell. It did not mention the heat. It did not mention what happened to men inside when anti-tank rounds penetrated, or when the engine caught fire, or when you ran out of ammunition with enemy tanks still advancing. A young boy approached him, noticing the iron cross pinned to his jacket. "Did you fight in a Tiger?" His eyes were wide with excitement. "These were the best tanks in the war, right? They could beat anything." Bear looked at the boy, then at the Tiger, then back at the boy. "Yes," he said quietly, "I fought in a Tiger. And yes, we could beat anything at long range. But the Soviets had more tanks than we had ammunition. They kept coming until they won. The best tank in the world still burns when you hit it enough times." The boy looked confused, his excitement deflating. Bear had seen that look before. The young wanted heroes and victory. They wanted to believe that superior weapons and courage guaranteed success. The truth was more complicated and far less satisfying. Superior weapons without the resources to employ them properly were just expensive ways to die. Courage without adequate support was suicide dressed in metals. He touched the Tiger's armor with his remaining hand, feeling the cold steel. For a moment he was back in the gunner's seat, eye pressed to the optics, watching T-34s emerge from the tree line in endless waves. He could smell the propellant smoke, could feel the heat of the engine, could hear Weiss loading rounds with mechanical precision, and Hartmann's calm voice directing fire, and Schmidt's scream when the engine exploded.
Then the moment passed, and he was just an old man with one arm in a museum surrounded by machines that had killed thousands and been killed in return. The Tiger before him was clean and perfectly restored, its paint fresh, its armor unblemished.
It looked nothing like Tiger 231 in its final moments, burning on the Prokhorovka battlefield, with its crew scattered and dying. That, Baer thought, was the greatest lie museums told. They showed the machines at their best, maintained and perfect. They did not show the reality of those machines in combat, broken and burning and filled with dying men. They did not show what industrial warfare really meant, not glory and triumph, but attrition and mathematics, and the slow realization that excellence could not overcome overwhelming material superiority. Prokhorovka was where the myth of German armored invincibility died. The Tigers and Panthers could destroy Soviet tanks at ratios that should have guaranteed victory. But the Soviets could afford the ratios. They could lose 3 tanks for every German tank destroyed and still win because they had 9 more tanks behind those 3. Germany could not afford even favorable exchange ratios. Every Tiger lost was irreplaceable. Every trained crew killed could not be adequately replaced. The battle consumed itself in a single day of mechanized fury. When the smoke cleared, the field was littered with the burned-out hulks of hundreds of tanks from both sides. The wheat that should have fed families was buried under steel and explosives. The earth was poisoned with fuel and oil and chemicals. Men who had woken that morning expecting to prove their courage in decisive battle were scattered as corpses across the killing ground. And for what? The Germans retreated, the Soviets advanced, the front line shifted a few kilometers. Strategic objectives were not achieved, tactical victories proved meaningless. The only certainty was that thousands of men would never go home, that thousands more were maimed like Baer, and that the war would continue for 2 more years of grinding attrition until Germany was ground into rubble and defeat. Baer left the museum that day in 1982 with a clarity he had lacked during the war. He finally understood what the burning of Tiger 231 had meant. Not just his personal tragedy of losing in harm and watching friends die, not just the tactical defeat of Operation Citadel, but the strategic truth that would determine the war's outcome. Germany had built the finest weapons that engineering could design. They had trained soldiers to the highest standards. They had developed tactics that should have guaranteed victory. But they entered a war of industrial attrition without the industrial base to sustain it. The Soviets understood this. They did not try to build better tanks than the Tiger. They built more tanks than Germany could destroy. They did not try to train better soldiers. They trained enough soldiers to overwhelm German positions through sheer numbers. The mathematics were always against Germany. The tragedy was that men like Schmidt and Krause had to burn inside steel coffins before that truth became undeniable. Baer died in 1987 at the age of 70. The obituary in the Munich newspaper mentioned his service in Heavy Panzer Battalion 503, his Iron Cross, his survival of the Battle of Prokhorovka. It did not mention the nightmares that never stopped. It did not mention how he flinched at the smell of diesel fuel for the rest of his life. It did not mention how he could never enter confined spaces with panic rising in his throat, remembering the fighting compartment of Tiger 231 filled with smoke and flame. His final request was to be cremated. He told his daughter that he had spent enough of his life in a steel box and would not spend eternity in another. She did not fully understand, but she honored his wishes. The ashes were scattered in the Bavarian Alps, far from the steppes of Russia, far from the killing fields of Prokhorovka. The mountains were peaceful and green, nothing like the landscape where he had lost his arm and his friends and his belief in mechanical superiority. But sometimes, when the wind blew from the east, his daughter swore she could smell diesel and cordite and burning steel. the smell that never left those who had been inside the Tigers, the smell that marked them forever as survivors of a battle that should have been glorious, but was instead simply the day that Germany's finest tanks burned across the Russian steppe and took their crews with them into fire and memory and the history books that would try, always inadequately, to explain what had happened when engineering met industrial might and lost.